In this episode, sociology professor Dr. Trevor Harrison examines the promise and peril of populism. Recent years have seen a swath of political leaders, notably on the right, espousing populist claims to represent the people. But what is populism? Why does it arise at some historical times, but not others? Why does populism attract so many people? What is its promise, its perils, and its future? These are just some of the questions examined in this talk.
I'm especially honored to be able to present this evening, given the many excellent talks that have already been given in this series. And finally, I want to welcome all of you out there for attending to this talk this evening. As Dr. Letts has said, my talk this evening is going to be about populism. During the presidency of Donald Trump, now ended, the term populism was frequently heard. Besides Trump, it has also been used to describe a host of other, mostly right-wing, not always, but mostly right-wing movements and leaders around the world, from England's Brexiters to Viktor Orban in Hungary, from Narendra Modi in India to Recep Erdogan in Turkey. I've written and spoken much about populism going back to my doctoral thesis in the early 1990s when I studied the Reform Party. The topic is one that has drawn me in again and again in the years since. Indeed, populism is as perennial as locusts and is hardy too. Every time it seems destined to be swept into history's dustbin, it rises anew from the ashes, and I'm given the opportunity again to speak about it. I hope my talk this evening will provide some clarity as to what populism is and what it isn't, and some explanation also for its current resurgence. My talk this evening will attempt to answer 4 specific questions. What is populism? Why has it returned? Why is it today primarily a right-wing phenomenon? And finally, is there a more nuanced and positive populism possible? First, however, I'm going to provide a brief history of populism. The term populism originated in the United States in the late 19th century. It was coined by journalists in describing the political discontents and aims mainly of agrarians in the American Midwest, incensed with the power of banks, railways, and grain merchants. The populists of the day viewed these institutions and their leaders, with some evidence, as ripping them off. This populist revolt was part of the broader progressive movement aimed at reducing the power of moneyed interests, ending government corruption, giving the vote to women, and advancing workers' rights. But the revolt of so-called regular folk already had deep roots in American political culture, going back to Andrew Jackson, and setting aside here, of course, the obvious point that Jackson's people did not include Blacks and Indigenous peoples. The 20th century has witnessed numerous figures described as populist, some famous and some infamous. Outside of the American experience, we can point to popular movements in Cromwell's England, the French Revolution, the slave revolts of the early 19th century, and Russia's peasant revolts later in that century, as well as the many popular revolutions in Latin and South America. So as I said, there's certainly some very infamous populists among this group. But Canada, of course, has its own portrait gallery of populists. The agrarian revolt came somewhat late to Canada, but its roots were similar to its American cousin: anger at banks, railway companies, and grain merchants. And to be honest, many of the ideas for the Canadian populist movements in the 1920s and 30s came from American populists themselves who brought those ideas, much worthwhile, to the Canadian experience. Again, the immediate impetus, however, for the populists of the 1920s was the ending of grain subsidies at the end of the First World War, which, with the result that several farmers' parties, as they were called, won election. We can name them off. Many of these are very famous to us. The United Farmers of Ontario in 1919 came out of nowhere and were elected. The United Farmers of Alberta in 1921. The United Farmers of Manitoba 1 year later in 1922. And to this, we can also add the huge success of the National Progressive Party federally in 1921, when out of nowhere, that party won 65 seats, second most in Canada's parliament. Then as now, however, the populist revolt was not just about economics. It was also about the diminishing political power of the agrarian sector and what we would term identity, revolving around a way of life threatened by urbanization, industrialization, and new moral and religious codes. By the time social credit and the CCF emerged in the 1930s, however, the farming sector was already in decline, and with it, populism. And so for a long time, populism seemed an historic relic, divorced from modern political realities. Suddenly, in the late 1960s and 1970s, the term was reborn in the US, and as before, soon found its echo in Canada, particularly in Alberta, beginning with the Reform Party in the late 1980s, Ralph Klein's PCs in the early 1990s, and a little later on, the Stockwell Day-led Canadian Alliance Party. Yes, you will note here a shameless plug for two of the books I've written on these particular parties. It is obvious then that populism wears many coats. We can note here that various people like Maxime Bernier being a libertarian, but on the other hand, Preston Manning, a fairly traditional conservative. We've noted before Adolf Hitler as a fascist, and others that span the array of people who have been told they are populists by someone or who have themselves claimed themselves to be populist leaders. So what, given this variety, what exactly is populism? First, populist movements and parties appeal to a mass audience, specifically a group defined as the people. Note that populism is not an ideology, hence the wide variety of people who are termed populist. In ideological terms, we would think of conservatism, liberalism, communism, Marxism. Populism is none of these things. For political leaders, however, populism's lack of ideological content makes it a very useful vehicle of political mobilization. That is, you can pull a lot of people together who might disagree on a number of things, but they see themselves as being one of the people. The effect of this is to erase the real differences that exist in modern societies between individuals and groups, making them magically disappear in a kind of political soup. Second, the appeal is made in the name of fending off a crisis threatening the aforementioned people. As we saw back in the examples of the 1920s and 30s, the threat can be economic, it can also be political or social. It can be even existential, directed at people's sense of identity again, perhaps as an occupation or a sense of belonging to a region that somehow is now threatened by events. Third, the source of this threat is a loosely identifiable elite. Now, this elite is sometimes located geographically outside of the society where the people live. More often, however, the identifiable group is physically present, but culturally outside the people. At its worst, the rhetoric of an elite trades in shorthand descriptions, cartoons really, of people one just doesn't like. Unscrupulous political leaders using populist rhetoric often employ ingrained stereotypes to rally the people. For example, Jews in Germany during the 1930s, and more recently, Muslims in much of the West. And of course, Donald Trump targeted Blacks and Latinos, reinforcing existing white fears, along with mentioning the liberal media, whom he also termed enemies of the people. In Western Canada, the anachronistic term Laurentian elite has become a convenient cue, a kind of Pavlovian dog whistle, for mobilizing Westerners feeling threatened by the economic, cultural, and environmental changes swirling around them, and so directed at Quebec and Ontario, literally pretty much everybody there. Fourth, this elite is viewed both as a threat and as illegitimate. Note here Donald Trump's repeated assertions that the 2020 election was rigged. A somewhat similar rhetoric was employed in Alberta immediately after the 2015 election, when conservative supporters insisted in describing the NDP as an accidental government. That is, it was not a government legitimately chosen by the people. Fifth, for populists, the fight against the elite constitutes a moral quest, a battle of right and wrong. Victory over the elite can be a source of cathartic release, a spiritual experience for populists. Note, for example, the reaction of Donald Trump's followers to his speeches and the exhilaration of insurrectionists on January 6th as they stormed Congress. Conversely, however, defeat can also be emotionally and psychologically wrenching. How is it, after all, possible that wrong, indeed evil, should win? The point is that defeat is not part and parcel of a regularized political process. It is instead on the level of a life and death struggle, in which the populist is psychologically and emotionally invested. For populists, there is no middle ground. It is a fight between us and them. Six, both the people and the elite, we have to finally realize, are really social constructions, generally built out of existing myths and prejudices, stereotypes, and repeatedly built through a series of discursive practices. These constructions require, therefore, constant renovation in order to maintain the polarized terrain upon which the political battle is fought. That is, for the supporters, it is necessary to keep reminding people of past grievances and who the actual enemy, the elite, actually is on a regular basis, lest they actually start to fall away from the people. So we come to the question, why populism, and why particularly now? We've seen that populism thrives when the people, however defined, and it could be by class, religion, region, race, ethnicity, a whole series of things. However the people are defined, they come to view themselves as threatened. The world today is indeed full of threats. There is economic uncertainty and inequality rising, particularly after the 2008 Great Recession. Many people have attributed the rise of Donald Trump and really a kind of breakaway from traditional republicanism as set off by that recession. That shook the basis of certainly the American political system, but also political parties around the world. And for a lot of people, the sense that an elite had done serious damage to the economy and not been punished afterwards, in fact, had come out very well. While a lot of people lost their homes, went bankrupt, lost their jobs, there was a sense of unfairness about how the 2008 Great Recession unfolded. And that, I think, has continued to ripple through much of our politics. There is also cultural stresses that have been brought about simply by globalization and new media sources that have made it very difficult to find our way through what is real and not real and just plain fake. David Goodhart has written a really compelling book about the situation in particularly England, in Britain, leading up to Brexit. But it actually pertains to much of the world. He talks about a description of two cultural worlds here. What he calls the anywheres. These are the people who, again, have done very well out of globalization, have become quite rich, and they can fly wherever they want. So they live anywhere, up until the time of pandemic, I guess. And the somewheres. And the somewheres, he says, are those people who are rooted in local communities, who have an attachment to local communities, but see those local communities under stress, right? And so now the logic of us, them is the somewheres, the people who are just regular folk, and this elite that maybe lives in New York or LA or London and seem to have the world as their oyster. To this, I would actually add perhaps a third group that Goodhart doesn't mention, and that I would say is the nowheres. These are the increasingly large number of people who are stateless, refugees, and migrants who have been tossed aside as the 21st century progresses. To the other stresses that are, I think, behind much of the rise of populism, we have a whole series of existential threats: terrorism, climate change, automation, which is threatening, I think, a lot of people's sense of, will I have a job, or my children have the same kind of job I had, identity once again. And finally, we can add to that the pandemic, which is a great provoker of stress for everybody having to deal with. Donald Trump, no doubt, spoke for many of his right-wing supporters about these accumulating threats in his inaugural and apocalyptic address in 2016. I will read from it. I wish I could do a better Donald Trump imitation. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation, an education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge, and the crime and the gangs and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now. Dispensing with the dystopic rhetoric, what Trump was actually saying was that things are going to hell in a handbasket. We need some strong measures and strong leaders to deal with it, and I'm that leader. Indeed, as Trump would no doubt say, the greatest leader of all time. A lot of Trump followers believed that in 2016 and still believe that today. Why does populism today seem primarily a right-wing phenomenon? Because I've already acknowledged that there's some very real stresses out there that, irrespective of politics, probably need to be dealt with straight on. Well, except perhaps for Bernie Sanders, it is hard, in fact, to think of a genuinely populist political figure on the left. When these do appear, they tend to be in non-liberal democracies, in former colonies, individuals such as Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro, where the rallying cry of the people is leveraged against external forces such as the US and foreign corporations. In liberal democracies, however, the equation is not so simple. Within such countries, pluralism of a sort reigns. While every party knows its political constituency, most centrist or left of center parties do not heavily emphasize divisions. The old Marxist critique of class is often buried beneath other concerns for equity, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, and I could go on. They practice big tent politics, attempting to appeal to the broad and expansive middle. After all, a vote is a vote is a vote, and the more votes, the better. Even where wedge politics are employed, the positions of middle or left-wing parties rarely migrate across an entire platform of policies. This was, in fact, also the way in Canada historically, with both the federal Liberals and progressive Conservatives. Beginning in the 1980s in the UK with Margaret Thatcher, and in the 1990s in the US, when Newt Gingrich forged the Republican contract with America, many conservative parties took a hard right turn in the name of tribal purity. More importantly, however, this involved a very calculated political stratagem. These parties reckoned that by taking uncompromising policy positions, they could, in the term used, harden their voters' tribal identification with the party. The path from there to the Tea Party movement to Trump was paved. There is no place in the world of right-wing populist parties for nuance or compromise, because these suggest weakness, a lack of purpose or belief, even falsehood. Right-wing populism brings the promise of purity, clarity, and truth. Beyond this, 5 things have contributed, I would suggest, mightily to the rise of right-wing populism. The electoral system, and particularly first past the post. Right-wing populism ignores the messiness of pluralism. It thrives best in political systems that ignore the give and take, the compromises required of political differences. Right-wing populism finds its greatest success in winner-take-all or first-past-the-post electoral systems, the kind of systems primarily used in the Anglo countries, although New Zealand and Australia have moved away from those pure systems in recent years. Under first-past-the-post, a political party can find success if it can get out its core supporters while discouraging or preventing those of its opponents. So 30%, if the other side doesn't get out their vote, can suddenly rise up to 35, 36, perhaps 40%. And 40% in the first-past-the-post system quite often will get you a majority of seats, even though it's not a majority of the votes. But note here, there's also a downside. Right-wing populist-inspired parties are increasingly finding that they reach an electoral plateau above which they cannot rise. This is the case, for example, for Canada's Conservative Party, whose roots, when it was transformed some years ago, are populist, whose support base is a solid 30%, and that 30% will not vary from voting for that party, but which has a difficult time expanding its tent. The result is that the Conservative Party federally is today reduced to hoping that the Liberals will do something scandalous or stupid, or both, and that voters will occasionally give Conservatives the key to Parliament. Fortunately for Conservatives, this is a hope often rewarded. Secondly, the second thing I want to point out here is the role of direct democracy and what I would call the leader principle. Right-wing populist parties are particularly fond of direct democracy. This was something that the Social Credit Party talked about endlessly before it was elected in 1935. Such things as referenda, initiatives, and recall, which we hear talk about again. By contrast, left-wing populist parties generally support representative democracy, even syndicalism, and such slow and boring things as committees and studies done by experts, precisely the sort of thing that right-wing populists dislike. The intent of direct democracy is to keep governments close to and even threatened by the people. But it also harkens to a mistrust of intervening bodies or institutions in general. For right-wing followers, the solution lies in a direct relationship with the leader. This faith in an individual leader, whether charismatic in the case of William Aberhart or simply authoritarian in the case of Donald Trump, is in keeping with a conservative tendency to defer to certain kinds of authority, often religious or business, though not to experts otherwise. The leader is both the symbol of the group and the unchallenged oracle of our unvarnished truth. Even after November 3rd, many Trump supporters continued to believe, against all evidence, that he had won the election. Even more starkly, many of the White House insurrectionists said they went to Washington because Trump had asked or told them to do so, and suppressed their disbelief in the outcome when they didn't seize government. As a woman named Brenda wrote, "He has a plan here. President Trump would not back down that easily. We need to stand strong, keep watch, and pray. Something big is coming, and God is going to see it through." The outgoing president, many continue to believe, must have more cards to play. Even now, many QAnon and other Trump supporters are waiting for a day of reckoning, which some believe is slated for early March. There is also the media piece. The tribalism of populism is replicated in our media, especially in the US. 91% of readers for whom the New York Times is the primary source of news are Democrats. Democrats also get much of their television news from CNN, but their media sources also tend to be fairly wide if consistent in their view. By contrast, 93% of those relying on Fox News are Republicans and heavy subscribers to talk radio, which in the US as well as Canada tends to be almost entirely right-wing. Talk radio in particular is an enormously influential and I would say also profitable media designed to attract listeners and sell advertising. Talk radio is what some observers have termed infotainment and others have termed argutainment. For its conservative listeners, however, talk radio and its popular hosts are a chief source of political truths, including revelations about conspiracies. And so we come to the conspiracy piece. We have seen that populism relies upon perceptions of a threat directed at the people. Fear of others or of the unknown is thus a great recruiting tool. A mistrust in institutions and experts is furthered if one believes that things are going on that elites are keeping from the people, and perhaps the leader is the one who actually knows what's going on and is telling you the truth. Now, I want to be absolutely clear about this. Everyone right across the political spectrum frankly believes something that under scrutiny doesn't square with the evidence, and others looking at it would say that's kind of an odd thing to believe. But studies suggest that supporters of the populist right tend more often to believe things that fall well outside of the normal Richter scale of rationality. Remember, Donald Trump's rise to the presidency began with his promotion of birtherism, claims that Barack Obama was not an American-born citizen, and in fact was a Muslim, which is code for being, again, an outsider. The study referenced in slide 13 reveals something of a universe of disbelief in which right-wing populists reside. This was a massive study of some 25,000 people conducted over many countries. And there was a consistency of what people who said they were followed right-wing populist parties and what they actually, things they believed in. It could range from that there was a conspiracy at 9/11. It could be such things as, for example, that the moon landings didn't actually ever occur. They, in fact, were faked in an Arizona desert. That HIV was a conspiracy by certain groups to infect people. And we see it even today. Some of the conspiracies around Bill Gates and others, that they are behind some kind of worldwide conspiracy. Right-wing populists, from the studies that have been shown, seem to believe many more of these things than non-right-wing populists, or just regular folk who aren't particularly populist at all. Why right-of-center voters may be more prone to believing in conspiracies is not entirely clear. Socialization through immediate family and friends or through media must surely play some part. But some studies also suggest that conservative leading voters may also be hardwired to be particularly hyper-attuned to potential hazards. That is, they see signs of danger, and trust their emotional gut more readily than do liberals. In any case, what we do know is that supporters of right-wing populist parties are more easily swayed by messages conveying fear than our left-wing supporters. And what we actually know about human behavior is there's sort of carrots and there's sticks. People will respond to hope, but they also very much respond to messages of fear and even messages of anger. And much of this we've seen in the last years as well. In turn, it also must be noted that because they're more sensitive to perceived threats, right-wing populists are genuinely confused that others do not see the threats they see, and may as a result even come to view the others as complicit in the approaching danger. That is, I see a threat here, you don't see it, so somehow maybe you're part of some group that in fact is instigating this. The propensity to respond or even over-respond to messages of fear is something easily manipulated by populist leaders. Finally, I want to come to the neoliberal piece, and I return here to something I was talking about before. Populism thrives on fertile ground. That ground could be religious or racial bigotry, but it can also be genuine economic and social concerns. Again, many of the concerns of the populists in the late part of the 19th century, many of the concerns of populists in places around the world where there's been some kind of revolt against a foreign colonizing elite, the concerns of people who are behind social credit and CCF in the 1930s, these are very real concerns. But again, these are not particularly ideological concerns. They need to be channeled. In the US and other countries, mainstream parties after the early 1980s adopted not dissimilar policies of neoliberalism. Low taxes, low public investment, privatization, deregulation, and above all, free trade. In Canada, the complaint of many of the people who were Reform Party supporters was there was no difference between the progressive conservatives and the liberals. And so they broke away and wanted to refashion one of those parties. In Great Britain, the same thing. The Thatcher conservatives gradually pulled the Labour Party over towards the center to the point where Tony Blair could simply say, we lost, we're not fighting for labor issues any longer. Neoliberalism is the way of the world. And in the United States, for many voters on either the left or right, in particular those who voted for Donald Trump, there was no great distinguishing difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. By the 1990s, by the 2000s, they looked pretty identical. They both agreed with free trade and all the measures that were accompanying that. As someone remarked to me at one point about the two American major parties, the Republicans are the party of big oil in Texas. The Democrats are the party of Wall Street, but otherwise there's not a heck of a lot of difference between them. In country after country, then both parties converged. And they converged around the conventional wisdom enunciated by Margaret Thatcher that there is no alternative. As Michael Lind has recently written, the result has been a class war between neoliberals, represented by mainstream parties of both types, who have done very well out of globalization, and working classes nearly everywhere. It should be no surprise then that the right-wing populist upsurge of recent years began in the two countries most strident in pushing neoliberalism, the UK and the US, because many of the people who were pulled along in that saw the devastation, particularly after 2008. Populism is non-ideological. Left-wing or center-left parties whose historic role was to represent the working classes could have addressed these legitimate concerns, but they didn't, leaving the ground open for people like Donald Trump to practice the kind of demagogic populism of the right that we have witnessed. I want finally to come to the promise of populism. It is, after all, in the title of my talk. Whether fulfilled or not, and too often, as I have shown, manipulated by dangerous demagogues for their own political purposes, the promise of populism lies in the notion of the unity of the people. It was there in the original idea of the French Revolution, when people greeted themselves, irrespective of class or gender, as citizen. It was there in the days after the Russian Revolution in the simple leveling term comrade. And it is there in the preamble of the American Constitution, starting with the phrase, "We the people." Promises often fall short of being fulfilled. So it is with populism. The fact that each of these efforts have too often run aground on the shores of prejudice, hatred, misunderstanding, and even violence does not negate the wish, the desire of a unity of the people defined by liberty, fraternity, and equality. In the end, we are, all of us, the people that no one let rend asunder.